We have digested the mess that was the Monday Night Football loss for the Giants at the hands of the Seattle Seahawks. What does it mean, big picture? Breaking down the schedule ahead, what the Giants should decide to do at the trade deadline, and ultimately, what could this season mean for Daniel Jones? We dive in next. Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where we are your host. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. No time for pleasantries. Why? Because there's nothing pleasant about the New York Football Giants. You saw us recap the game, obviously, and that high-level focus was on Daniel Jones and ultimately what feels like the regression of a quarterback. But Andy, now we dial in our focus on what it means being a 1-3 football team, the schedule ahead, and decisions that need to get made here for the New York Football Giants.
Yeah, listen, we can wax poetic all day about the things that went wrong against the Seahawks on Monday night, but Adam, we got to start thinking forward and have to make tough decisions about what's going to happen based on how the Giants are playing, what's going on with the team, where their record stands. And when you look at the record, I mean, let's just call a spade a spade. They are going to be double-digit underdogs in their next two games, both on the road, which to me says presumably most people think the Giants are going to be 1-5. And like when you're 1-5, Adam, that feels like it's time to figure things out. I don't know. Where do you go with, like, should the Giants already be thinking? What does the schedule look like for you?
Yeah, I don't think it's that hard to really. I don't think it's that hard. I think you're going to hear me across the course of this episode be pretty clear and crystallized around what the New York Football Giants should be doing. 5 of their next 7 games are on the road. You mentioned at Miami, at Buffalo. They'll be home for Washington and home for the Jets, and then they'll go on the road against the Raiders, the Dallas Cowboys, and the Washington Commanders. So, listen, over the next 2 games, yeah, they're going to be 1-5, and maybe you have a little bounce back in you. But in totality, when you look across those next handful of games, but by the way, there's not a single game on the schedule you can go into and say, well, that's a winnable game. There's nothing winnable right now for this team. So at what point are you going to look at this and just say, well, yeah, 1-5, and then maybe 1-6, and maybe 1-7, maybe 2-8? Like, it doesn't really matter at this point. For me, when I look at the schedule ahead, it just paints the picture. We understand. We said it last episode coming out of the loss. We thought the Giants could be 2-2 after the first 4 games. It's only a 1-game difference. It's not. They have not been good enough on the field. You cannot fix all these problems week over week in the course of this season. This team is going to lose a lot of football games this year. That's where
Adam,
I'm at.
the toughest part is when you go look at the schedule before the season, you kind of do everyone does it, every fan does it. You're like, oh, that's
We
a
all
win.
say we shouldn't, but we all do it.
Right. That's a win. That's a loss. That's a win. How are we going to get a win in here? Oh, maybe we'll sneak this one. And you do that. If you look at the remaining schedule for the Giants, I don't know if they're going to be favored in any game for the rest of the season. Like the games that we were like, oh, that should be a win for the Giants. Like, are we sure that the Giants are going to be able to beat the Rams? Like, are we sure that the Giants are better than the Rams? Going into the season, you may have said, sure, like Giants were a playoff team, Rams, had a bunch of injuries. That doesn't look like a win. Are we thinking the Giants are going to go into New Orleans and beat the Saints with that defense? Like, I don't have any
Do we think
confidence
the
to do that.
Giants are going to get a win in their own division?
What?
Do we think
Yeah.
they're going to beat the Commanders either spot, right?
And when you start looking at this based on how the offense plays, you still have the Eagles twice. You have the Cowboys again. You have to play New England and Bill Belichick. You have to play the Jets, which is basically like a neutral site game with against that defense. Like the only games that you're looking at that you're like, we got a shot that they'll still not be favored in are the games against the Commanders and the Raiders. And so when you're thinking about like we're only a quarter way through the season, as you mentioned, the play on the field has been so bad that you look at the rest of the season and say, I don't see how we scrape together 8 wins, 9 wins, and be able to get to the opportunity to play in the playoffs, right?
No, listen, I mean, we could talk about injuries happen across the league. You don't know what's going to happen next. You have to take it week by week, and every single matchup is different, right? But come on, man. I mean, listen, you want to tell me they go out next week and they somehow beat Miami on the road? Yeah, that'll change. That'll shift the perspective. But you can't look at any of these things and think that it's likely. And right now, if you're talking about win totals on the year, to your point, it's not about, oh, is that a winnable game or not? How can you sit here right now and say that the Giants can be anything more than a 5-win football team at best if they catch some guys the right way? Maybe, yeah, listen, the Jets defense is good, but you can still try to just scrape your way by there, or Zach Wilson's so bad. We don't know, Andy. There's a world when we go to that matchup and Zach Wilson is still the starting quarterback for the Jets. How about this for a narrative? Zach Wilson looks better than Daniel Jones as a starting NFL quarterback. That's going to be a conversation that happens here if these next few weeks keep unfolding that way. So no, as tier one, high level, I do not, there's no point to look at the schedule going forward and say anything other than you can only assume every game is a loss until this team demonstrates they're capable of winning, especially on the offensive side of the ball.
You couldn't be more right. And Adam, when you look at the NFL trade deadline is October 31st, which
Yep.
means New York Football Giants will play 4 games prior to the NFL trade deadline. And ironically, the last game they play is against the Jets, and then the trade deadline is 2 days later. So the Giants will see what Zach Wilson has potentially if he's still playing, and the Giants will have a really good indication at that point on what they need to do in the next 4 games. Do you think the Giants win any of the next 4 games as it currently stands?
Well, and I think the way to encapsulate this, you mentioned the trade deadline, which is going to lead us into decisions around a lot of veteran players on this roster. Do I think, and I said, win loss, but like, yeah, could you tell me they lose the next 2 games and then they beat Washington and New York? Sure. Right. And right before the deadline, they're 3-5. And from a record standpoint, you'll look at the landscape, and especially if you beat the Commander, say, okay, maybe. And then you'll circle, double underline, bullet points around that Packers game because that could be for the 3rd wild card spot potentially. Sure. Sure, that's possible. But in the big picture, this team is not competing for anything this year. And I don't even mean at the highest level because we never said they were going to be a Super Bowl team, but they're not competing to go on a little run in the playoffs right now. It's just not going to happen. So then you have to dial it back and say, what are the decisions that this organization needs to make to be smart about what the offseason and next year is going to look like? And that's when we get to some veteran players on this roster. Easy ones like Leonard Williams, easy ones like Adoree Jackson, right? Veteran guys on expiring contracts that could have value to other teams in the league. But then we get to interesting ones. You can talk about those guys, Andy, but then we get to the 2 more interesting ones to me, and that's Saquon Barkley and that's Xavier McKinney. Those are not just veteran guys. Those are not older players. Those are young guys that are talented, but do not have a long-term future with where we think this organization is going to need to be over the next 2 or 3 seasons.
Yeah, you mentioned it. It seems pretty simple. Like when a team doesn't see aspirationally a path to get to the playoffs or a path to be competitive, you look at your 30-year-old plus veterans that are on the last year of their deal that may not re-sign with the team, and you see what kind of draft capital you can get to move them to a contender, a team that is just that one piece away or wants to shore up their defensive line or whatever it's going to be. You mentioned Adoree Jackson, prime candidate, especially with Trey Hawkins and Deontay Banks looking decent. It feels like you may as well send him off. He's playing in the slot, which is like not where he needs to be anyway. And if these 2 guys in Hawkins and Banks play well, he doesn't really have a role on this team moving forward. And so you're absolutely right. I think those are no-brainers for the Giants to at least evaluate if the next couple games don't go the Giants' way. Yeah, I could see a world where Xavier McKinney is primed to be able to move out, for a whole host of reasons. I mean, Adam, you see him in press conferences. He seems disinterested. He seems like he's kind of like scoffing at, some of the questions that are being asked. I just think that he doesn't want to be here, frankly.
Well, yeah, and so just and really quick on the 2 high level contracts, Leonard Williams and Adoree Jackson, just so we know, when we talk about dead money and cap savings, moving Leonard Williams during the season here, you're still going to take a dead cap hit on that contract, but you will clear some cap space off. Likewise for Adoree Jackson, they're both in the positive, but you are going to take some dead money. To what extent that's going to look like, I think that would be interesting to explore if you're the Giants, and maybe that's the pushback here, where if we're talking high level, well, if they don't move these players, are they making a massive mistake? Joe Schoen may say, well, I don't want to put bad money on the books. I don't want to prolong the problems. I think what it'll come down to with some of these players is what is the market for them, right? Now, if you tell me dead cap money equals a 2nd round pick, okay, now you got to talk about that, right? If you say that it equals a 4th or 5th round pick, that's a little bit of a different discussion. To your point on Xavier McKinney, I'll just say this. I'm not going to knock anybody in post-game press conferences when you get kind of punched in here. I bet Xavier McKinney wanted to say something like, well, I tell you what, if our quarterback didn't suck, we probably could have won that game. Am I right, fellas? So I get there being a level of frustration. But if you tie in the fact that in the offseason, he wanted a contract extension, the Giants didn't come to the table with that necessarily. And now you think about paying a guy, even on a franchise tag, something in the 11 or $12 million territory, the Giants aren't going to be able to afford to do that. He's a young player. He has a real future in the league still to be a quality player in the secondary. He's a guy that I think you circle even over Saquon Barkley and say, there's capital here. You can move this player and get something of significance potentially back in return.
I mean, Adam, Xavier McKinney's only 24 years old. He's obviously in the last year of his deal because he was an early second-round pick instead of being a first-round pick. No fifth-year option on Xavier McKinney. Obviously was looking to try to get his money and get an extension, and the Giants said no. They said no. I mean, Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll and team, and Wink Martindale probably was included in this at some point to get his take. They said, no, we'd rather you play it out, and I want to see if you'll earn it. You mentioned a franchise tag as a potential option for Xavier McKinney. Do you want to give him $14.46 million next year on a one-year deal? Like, is that exciting to you? Do you want to give him a 4-year deal at $15 million a year with like half of it guaranteed? Like, does that seem like it's exciting for you? Or would you rather go with Dane Belton, Jason Pinnock, and others and use the money elsewhere? It just feels like it makes too much sense if the Giants fall out. He is an asset that a team would give up decent draft capital. And if the Giants aren't going to sign him long-term, it makes all the sense in the world.
Likewise, when we look at Saquon Barkley, we get it. We understand what coulda, woulda, shoulda been, right? He was drafted at the wrong time by an organization that shouldn't have invested the second overall pick in him, and the team has been bad. So be it. He also suffered a high ankle sprain this season, and it took him a while to come back from that. Still hasn't been back on the field. If over these next couple of games he gets on the field and shows that he's reasonably healthy, you have to think about it. He's on the franchise tag. You're going to be right back in the same waters in the offseason. Again, does this feel like we're kind of having the sky is falling type of discussion? You can say that. You can say that, oh, well, if they do X, Y, and Z when they have more cap room this upcoming offseason, we know that was the goal to get to that place for this organization. I get it. But again, and this does come down to value, right? Somebody says they want to give you. What does it take, right? No one's giving you a second-round pick for Saquon Barkley and an expiring contract. Let's be clear. It's a rental. But if you tell me that somebody wants to give you a 4th and a 6th-round pick, guess what? If Joe Schoen believes, as he talks about and preaches, building through the draft, then those assets matter. And if you don't think you're bringing him back, biggest factor. If you don't think you're going to even go back to the discussion table with him, now seeing another injury for him, I think you have to be willing to talk about that. Because otherwise, what? He could either walk, you're going to tag him again next year, and I don't think that's going to go the same way it did this season, where Saquon ultimately settles back in and says, I'm going to show up, let's adjust the numbers a little bit. He will hold out next year, rightfully so.
You said it before. We have 4 weeks before 4 more games are going to be played for the Giants before the trade deadline is upon us. 2 of them, they are going to be double-digit underdogs on the road, like no hope. The other games could be a coin flip at best for the Giants. So when you're looking at this, Adam, your best case scenario is you're 3-5. Is that the best case scenario at this point? Like if all things go well, and then are you investing at the trade deadline with games against the Cowboys, 2 games against the Eagles, et cetera? It's a really difficult situation for the Giants to be in. The way that they're playing, it feels like they'll be sellers, right? But then let's say you trade all of those players away. It still begs the question of what do you do about Daniel Jones? You've signed him to this contract. He is your starting quarterback for right now. What do you do with your franchise QB?
Nothing. It doesn't matter. At that point, it won't matter. If the team isn't performing and he's not performing, and then you move a few assets, guess what? He ain't going to get any better. And he's under contract next year. Guess what? This team, we may reflect back on, hey, that win against Arizona actually could be a really detrimental one when we talk about next year's draft and where they are in the hierarchy there. But the bottom line is, listen, someone's got to play QB. So, it costs you $20 million. But if next year turns out to be still a rebuilding year for the Giants, go ahead, Daniel Jones. Get out there, because we'll still have the same conversation. We'll get to the offseason. You'll try to make the decisions. You'll think more bigger picture than short term. And then, okay, Daniel Jones, you go out and you play. You look all right. Guess what? We drafted a quarterback. Are we going to go ahead and let that 3rd year kick in and pick up some of the bigger money? Maybe. Will we go ahead and get out of it and look for a veteran ahead of our rookie? Probably. It's all good. It's all good. And let's be clear here. It's not like anyone is calling the New York Football Giants and saying, hey, what do you want for Daniel Jones making $40 million a year? It's not happening. So he'll just, hey, guess what, man? You're going to ride out the string. Turns out what you were was a top 10 bridge quarterback. That's going to end up being the scenario for Daniel Jones if this thing goes fully off the rails.
Listen, I think it's interesting. The contract, let me get to the contract piece of it, Adam.
Yeah.
Daniel Jones will 100% be on this roster if starting week 1, if the Giants miraculously can't find a trade for him somewhere, out in the ether. And the reason why is because of the money. Daniel Jones's dead cap, if he is not on this roster, is $69 million next season. His cap hit is $47 million if he's on the roster. So it would actually cost the Giants an extra $22 million to not have Daniel Jones on the roster. Think about that. And so there's just really no way that the Giants can get out of his contract at all if things go this route. Now, keep in mind, if he is on the roster next year, the following year, it's only $22 million in dead cap. That feels kind of like the break-even point on where the Giants may get value to be able to do things elsewhere. So almost no matter what, he's going to be on this roster. And so do you build around him? Do you figure out how to get the most out of him? Is this all still salvageable? Those are questions that they're going to have to ask leading up to, the next couple of games and that trade deadline that we mentioned.
Yeah, I think you just keep building. You keep looking for quality players, right? You look to get better on both sides of the ball. Daniel Jones is not a factor in that process right now. You're not drafting with him in mind right now. If it's go next off season, we're just talking about, hey, we need talented offensive linemen. We need talented defensive linemen. We need linebackers. We need corner safety, whatever it is, right? We need wide receivers. That's all that we're doing. We're trying to put better players on this roster. Daniel Jones, this is not the twilight of Aaron Rodgers' career. This is not Joe Burrow, a guy that has proven he is one of the best quarterbacks in the league, and you need to find a way to get him opportunities to win championships. This is just a guy. It's an expensive guy. It's maybe too expensive of a guy, but that's all that he represents right now. So there's nothing. And by the way, when we said this, we've been right, we've been wrong. That's the nature of it. But when people said the Giants made, quote, all-in moves this offseason, you and I both pushed back and said nothing that they did indicates all-in moves. It indicates that this year and next year, and then they have outs on everything, including Darren Waller, right, including other players on this team. And two last notes that I'll just make here. Darren Waller, I don't know. Does that become mildly interesting here when you move towards the trade deadline and think about players that you could move potentially if this thing is a mess? And also a guy like Paris Campbell. Now, he hasn't looked particularly good, but if I can get a 7th round pick for Paris Campbell, I'm doing it. Wan'Dale Robinson, you're back, right? And maybe ultimately, Andy, at the end of the day, we may be talking more about things like that. When you go and look at Leonard Williams' money, it's still a big dead cap hit. When you look at Xavier McKinney, it's still a big dead cap hit. Saquon Barkley's unique. That actually makes sense for them to move him here because he's on that tag. Then you look, I think, at maybe fringe pieces that you move on from because it doesn't hurt your cap. It doesn't hurt you going forward. And maybe you grab some of these back-end assets in next year's draft class. Do you think that, at the end of the day, is that the more likely of the two, that it's some of these fringe pieces that get cast away because Joe Schoen, big picture, is saying, I do not want dead cap money to depending on assets, right? I'm not taking on $20 million in dead cap to get me a 5th and 6th round pick potentially.
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, Joe Schoen is going to protect what keeps them relatively healthy to build and make moves. I don't, if there's short-term pain for long-term gain, Joe Schoen has shown that he's willing to do that. He hasn't restructured guys like Leonard Williams. He hasn't given Adoree Jackson a new deal. He's okay with taking a little bit of pain if it's going to help them build ultimately. And so that's why these 4th, 5th, 6th round picks might be the way to do it. Adam, the one thing I wanted to close out with, though, is even if we're talking about the Giants drafting another quarterback at some point in the next upcoming draft, I also have concerns as to whether or not they have it figured out when they came in. They had Daniel Jones. They declined his option. He played well. So then they liked him all of a sudden. Now they're out on him. It's like they've kind of also flip-flopped a little bit on how they felt about Daniel Jones. I don't know if that gives me confidence that they know exactly what it is that they want from a quarterback.
You know the way it works, man. It's year to year, right? 1 year, Brian Daboll's coach of the year, Joe Schoen we trust. And now as this year unfolds, you start to go, well, whether or not Daniel Jones is playing good or not, whether or not Bobby Johnson's a bad offensive line coach, I'm sorry. someone's making these decisions, right? Like you don't get all the glory and none of the blame here. These are real questions. And I know I'm extending this a little bit, but I just want to make a little additional footnote here around an Ashawn Robinson, who's 28 years old. Like we're probably going to put together a different list here, not just the high profile guys, but there's a lot of depth and nice pieces that playoff and championship teams would like to have on their roster in the short term. And maybe those are the decisions that we'll start to judge Joe Schoen on, which will be a really weird bag, Andy, because we'll be talking about he brought in Ashawn Robinson. What a smart move. And then we'll say he traded Ashawn Robinson away. What a smart move. I don't know. And I think that's the worst part about all this. We are entering the murky waters of not knowing anything about anything. We don't know if Brian Daboll is 100% this coach of the year play guy. We don't know if Joe Schoen is the greatest GM in the history of the Giants organization, right? Like he's no Ernie Accorsi. We can say that much. We've gotten so many more questions. 4 weeks into the season, and we have 7 new questions that we never thought would have existed. That's the state of this Giants team right now. That's what makes it so brutal. Guys, go ahead.
It's not the record of 1-3. It's how the 1-3 has come to be. Do you like that, Ryan? Is that a good way to end this, Adam? What do you think?
I think so. Guys, you know what you do? You get over to YouTube. You go ahead and you subscribe to the One Giant Podcast. You get over to Twitter at AndyMac214, at Adam Arbrecht, and at One Giant Podcast. You get the podcast on your podcast feed. You share it with your friends because misery, why, it loves company. And until next time, as Andrew Makowitz would want me, by the way, we are going to talk about an upcoming matchup. Can you believe it? Let's break down film on the Miami Dolphins on the road. Good Lord. As Andrew Makowitz would want need a nay, miserably demand the people know. Does he still say it? Does he still say it?
As always, let's go Big Blue.